Okay, we're live. I am here with Violet Fenn. I'm really excited about this. I have your book, everybody, so everybody
Yay!
can see
Oh, thank you
history of the
so much.
vampire and popular culture. And I love the tag, "The love at first bite." That is really great. Um, to me, it's a fascinating subject as somebody who grew up very interested. Of course, my age, I'm a child of the Anne Rice novels. That
Yeah.
was sort of my introduction into the whole thing. But for you, where did the interest or fascination with vampires begin?
Oh gosh, and it's so far back that I've been trying to think about this because I've been talking about the book obviously a lot recently, and it's so far back that I can barely remember. It actually came through music. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and my first biggest love music-wise was The Damned, the punk band The Damned, and still is really. And a friend of my dad's, when couldn't have been more than 10 or 11, he was clearing out a jukebox he had and gave me a copy of New Rose by The Damned on vinyl. And I loved them. And they were just sort of getting into their goth look at that point. Dave Vania is the sole reason I've got a white streak in my hair. It took me years to do it, but I copied Dave. Cheers, Dave. Um, so it went from that. And then I was born in 1969. So, when video recorders started coming out, we could record things that were on late at night. And my dad started recording the Universal horror movies for me. So they'd be on like in the middle of the night, and then maybe my brother would watch them the next day because they're not really, as anyone knows who's seen them, they're not really horrors. So it kind of started with that, the mummy's hand and all that sort of stuff. And I got into the sort of literally sort of the gothic element of it, the look of it and the feel of it all. And it came from that because obviously the epitome of vampires to me is Christopher Lee as Dracula. So I saw his 1958 version of Dracula, and Hammer, all the Hammer movies. So it came from that. Music sort of kicked it off, and then because I was lucky, I grew up when goth was starting to be a thing, so I've grown up with it, and then it got into the old movies because it's the old versions that I really love. Some of the newer ones are amazing, but yeah, late night movies, courtesy of my dad, is where it came from.
Everything fun like this always has to spawn from our childhood. It's
Yeah.
always got to be some kind of childhood memory. The thing that I find most fascinating about vampires, and you see this, I think, to an extent with zombies, but not near as much, is the variation of the interpretation.
Mm.
They can be interpreted so wildly. You can get into stuff like like Blade or Buffy the Vampire Slayer, where they're just demonic monsters, like almost like just eating machines. And then you can get into like the Anne Rice stuff, or even the Twilight stuff, where it's more of a romanticized sort of. Out of those, which one do you have one that you prefer over others?
Oh gosh. Do you know what? There's so many. I like the more classic ones. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're the old ones, but the classic look. I love Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula with Gary Oldman. I mean,
Mhm.
that's one of the hottest Dracs there ever was. Um, because it's not true to the book, despite the title. They play a bit fast and loose with the book. Um, but that to me is the epitome of that look. So, but equally, I I'm well known for absolutely loving the BBC adaptation of Dracula again from last year, and the Mark Gatiss version of Stephen Moffat, and with Claes Bang playing Dracula, because that came into the modern world. He's in the modern world towards the end of it, but they're still almost going by the old rules. So I suppose Dracula is my thing, Dracula himself. Um, but what we have to remember is there is no template for vampires. It's been picked up over the years. Vampires have only existed for just over 200 years anyway, because Polidori came out with it in 1819. There was a slightly earlier one. There is a poem called Der Vampir by Heinrich Ossenfelder from the late 1780s, I think, a German poet. And that is the sort of first literary version of what we would recognize as a vampire. Unfortunately, he's a little bit rapey, but yeah, but it's getting towards the same thing. And then you've got Polidori, who basically turns his boss, who was Byron, into this idea of a vampire because it was written on the same weekend that spawned Frankenstein. They were all he was one of the group at the house when they were writing stories. So it's a new thing, because before that you had I always call them revenants, but they're more your zombies. They are literally undead that rise from the grave, and they feed off people. I mean, the history of it goes back millennia. But we've only got the sort of glamorous vampires that we know now, really, and not until Dracula in 1895, because Polidori's vampire was a gentleman, although a murderously blood-sucking one. And Stoker sort of set the template. But even Stoker's Dracula doesn't specifically have fangs. He has sharp teeth. He's described as having sharp teeth, but that's it. He doesn't die in daylight. It weakens him, but it doesn't die in it. The daylight thing comes from Nosferatu, because I'm sure most people know by now, Murnau did Nosferatu without permission. It is literally a takeoff of Dracula. That's what he wanted to do, and he wasn't given permission by Frances, Bram Stoker's widow. So he did Nosferatu and changed some of the details in the hope of not getting sued. Didn't work, he got sued. His film company went bust. But so that thing about Nosferatu, he crumbles in the daylight and collapses and whatever, that was done to differentiate it from Dracula. So there is no set thing for it. So you can write any vampire you like. It's just picked things up as it goes along. Or you've got True Blood, from the Charlene Harris books. The running sort of joke in that is that Bill Compton says, no, we can see, you can see us in mirrors. We're not scared of garlic, and all this sort of thing. And his argument for that is, well, wouldn't that be a clever thing? If you convinced humans that you can't see a vampire in a mirror, then if you can see me in a mirror, I'm not a vampire. So I always thought that was really clever. So this is where I realise I've gone completely rambling off, and I forget what the original point was, because I do tend to just keep talking once I get going. But yeah, I'm not sure you can say if there's a favourite specific vampire, because a lot of them have got really interesting takes. They're all so different. I love Underworld. I love Celine in Underworld. Blade is just hilarious because it's ridiculous, and I just it's so kitsch in its ways, and Blade's amazing. But by the same token, one of my favourite vampire movies ever is Byzantium, which a lot of people haven't seen. It's from 2012, and it's a British movie set at the seaside. And they're female vampires for a start, and they're really in some ways ordinary people just trying to get by. And I just love the difference, I think, the fact that they're all different.
Well, and it's such a interesting interpretation that you can take something that, you just say the word vampire, and pretty much anybody in Western culture is going to know what you're talking about. They're going to know sunlight, holy water, garlic, silver, crucifixes, need a coffin to sleep in, and yet it can be a wide range of, you can make a vampire romantic movie, you can make a vampire action movie, you can make a vampire horror movie, and you can make a vampire kids movie. You know what I mean? Like, it is so broad. I was just thinking
one of the best ones is Hotel Transylvania.
Yeah, I was just going to bring that up. I was watching that with my kids not that long ago, and I'm like, and I've got all the Anne Rice stuff in the back of my head. I'm like, and it just kind of like occurred to me. And it was shortly after that our both of our good friends, Jessica, told me about your book. And I'm like, well, that's just fascinating, because that was just kind of an idea that occurred to me. Like, it is such a broad subject. You can have two kids, here we've got Halloween coming up, and you can have two kids wearing vampire costumes for Halloween, and they can be two totally drastic interpretations of it.
Vampires don't look, or some of them just look totally ordinary. Some interpretations, they're just somebody walking down the street. The Twilight vampires, who sparkle, which is weird, but I must just say, a lot of people assume, because I'm forever snarking on Twilight, and people think I hate it. I don't hate it. I absolutely love it. I love it. I own all the movies. I've got all the books. I'm trying to plow through Midnight Sun on my Kindle and struggling, but I've got the lot. And it's good, sparkly fun. It's terrible ethically and morally. It's appalling, and but that's a whole different thing. But they are, to all intents and purposes, the ones that are the main ones in the movie, normal people. The Twilight vampires don't even have fangs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they've got human. I'm not quite sure how this works, how you can eat neatly. They've got razor sharp human teeth, apparently. So how the hell after creeping into Bella's bedroom and then kissing her? Firstly, he crept in, and secondly, he's presumably going to cut her tongue off as he's kissing her. But so they're all completely different. So they can be a normal person walking down the street. They can be in Hotel Transylvania, it's a narky teenager fighting against her dad. It's such a normal story. Or they can be your full-on Anne Rice type, gothic, glamorous, deadly vampires that look like vampires as we would perceive it. So yeah, it's a blank slate, and it is a massive subject. I don't think I realized how massive until I tried to turn it into a book.
Mm-hmm.
Just what a massive thing I put on myself to do it. Because even though I have to say in the introduction, in the book, because I knew people would complain, that I've kept a lot about some things in that people won't like and not mentioned other ones that people love, because there's no way you can cover everything. It's, as you say, there's so many different versions. They've been going since we had newspapers, or penny dreadfuls. Varney the Vampire in the mid 1800s. That was a penny dreadful, and that the writer of that was paid by the line, so he kept it going. There are tens of thousands of pages, I think, in the end of Varney the Vampire, because he was getting paid as long as he wrote it. So there was definitely the market for it from the start. People have always had a fascination with it. But yeah, it's amazing. It's, I think, more than any other trope or genre, there are more different varieties.
Mm-hmm.
Because like I said, if you go back to zombies, I mean, zombies are zombies, aren't they?
Mm-hmm. Well, I thought it was interesting that I've come to the, and I don't know, I'm not like a social scientist or anything, but one of the things that I always attributed to zombies, and one of the reasons why people enjoy zombies and zombie shows and zombie movies, is that as human beings, I believe there's this very small part of our brain that's programmed to kill. But that is overridden by societal norms. I mean, the simple fact that, we just feel bad about killing people. But if you've got a gun in a field of zombies, you can just go to town and not feel bad about it, right? Like, you can just open up and be like, yay. So I feel like that there's a little bit of a fascination there. But when we switch that over to the vampire side, it's interesting to me, and you noted this in your book, how much there's sort of a sexual angle to it, how there's sort of a sensual, sort of romantic, dark seduction side to that. What do you, I guess I would say, excuse me, for vampires, was that kind of always there from the beginning, or is that sort of something that evolved over time?
No, that's always been there. That's always been there from the very start. As I said, the very first vampire in literature, as we would call it a vampire, is Ossenfelder's in the 1870s, and that was a very seductive and almost sexual assault level vampire, but it was based around sex. Polidori's is the same, he's seducing women, then you get to Dracula, who is clearly after Mina Harker, so most of it is about seduction. It gets less like that as we come into the more modern era, where they are still doing that, and male and female vampires are being the seducers. But perhaps because our media has spread across more genres, and we are more widely read, and we watch and read these things just for pleasure now, not for an illicit thrill. That's when you've got ones that aren't specifically that, they may just have a storyline, or or you've got the kids versions like Hotel Transylvania, where it's more about her relationship with her father, and it just happens to be funny and cool at the same time. So I think that, and also I suppose society has become more accepting of sexuality, not as much as it ought to be still, obviously, as we know, but far more publicly than it used to be. So in the 1800s, there would be an illicit thrill in reading it. Varney the Vampire even is quite pulp novel-y in the way it's written, even though it's quite naive in its way. it's all about how this woman looks draped around, you know, and it's all quite specific, and it's the gaze, the reader's gaze is on the victim, sort of thing. So but yeah, I mean, I think it was always going to be based around human sexuality, because it's that level of vulnerability. It's you don't need to page Dr. Freud, you know, to draw the conclusions between, you've got sharp fangs penetrating delicate necks, you know. I mean, you're not going to get more illustrative than that, really, are you? And swooning victims. So no, I think it's always been there, but only from the point where it turned into the modern vampire. Before that, your revenants and your undead were scary, and that was that. And you wanted to stay a million miles away from them. They were not being seductive. Some would have been, you know, in old days you've got the incubus and succubus, and there were demons seducing men and women. So some would have been, but still probably in a scary and not as entirely pleasant kind of way. Whereas your Dracula, whether it's Gary Oldman or, you know, Bela Lugosi or whoever, there's a swooning victim that isn't quite sure that they don't want it, or they do, or they, you know. So no, I think the modern interpretation of vampires in general is always going to come back to that sort of thing. Yeah.
Well, that's what I thought was I had to go back, and I didn't even excuse me, I put the movie Blade on a couple weeks ago, and I didn't even end up watching the whole movie. I just felt like watching the open scene again, because I always kind of wondered if it was semi poking fun at that. Because if you remember the opening scene to that movie, where there's this guy just following this woman that he met, and she's like taking him to this like new swank, you know, dance club, and they go in through these doors and these cadavers hanging, and he's like, well, that's kind of weird, but I'm going to keep following this woman because she's super attractive and she's taking me somewhere and into this dance club. And then what's all this stuff coming from the ceiling that's spraying, and oh my God, it's blood, and oh no. And then, oh no, Blade's here. It was exactly like you said. It's so over the top ridiculous. I enjoy the living crap out of it for what it is. Because there was, and I'm semi switching here, how you had said that prior to that, it was, you know, the sexualization of it, that it was scary. Because I thought it was incredibly interesting. This, I believe it was in Eastern Europe, where there was kind of this vampire crazies, where people were like obsessed that those who had recently died were coming up. What was the story behind that?
Yeah, that was Serbia in the 1700s, and there was Arnold Powell. I can't pronounce that myself. Paole. Arnold Powley. Died, but before he died, he'd said he'd been attacked by a vampire, and at that point they were still referring, this is in the 1700s, and they're still referring to undead, sort of risen from the grave people at this point. He alleged he'd fought off a vampire, and then he died. I think he fell off a hay cart and broke his neck or something. And then things kept happening around the village, and they were convinced it was him, and he was coming back. There's a couple of different episodes of it. This is all Serbia at the time, and basically they got the idea that people were rising from the grave to feed on the other villagers. Some reports think they were taking revenge on people who had wronged them in life and whatever. The chances are, and almost certainly, that it was consumption. It was tuberculosis going around and killing people off. But it's, in the days before sort of real medical knowledge, they couldn't see it, so they didn't understand it, so therefore it must be magic, must be the supernatural. So a chap called Fluckinger was sent out to oversee it and to investigate, and witnessed. By this point there's newspapers as well, so newspapers were reporting on this, and when I was writing the book I managed to find the original newspaper reports, and so he reports them opening graves up, you know, and bodies corpses looking as if they're bloated, as if they've fed. And as I was explaining to Jess Cale actually yesterday, the decomposition of a human body makes that happen anyway. So at a certain point in a human body, it's bloated. There's purge fluid, which is a dark reddish black fluid that is made up just of everything breaking down. And if you happen to open a grave at the right point, you're going to get a bloated looking corpse with what looks like blood coming out of its mouth, you know. So they obviously staked them, because that's what you do with corpses if you're not sure what to do, apparently. And yeah, but it was massive, and because newspapers were just starting to get a big thing, and starting to spread everywhere, the news could be spread around. You know, you heard about it, and there was other stories from other countries that bear so many similarities. They're almost certainly the same story, and it's been rehashed, and they end up being sort of the early urban legends. But yeah, that was Serbia in the 1700s. And then you've got Mercy Brown in New England, the New England vampire panic. And that was, without looking, I can't remember the actual dates for that, but it was in the 1800s. And that's consumption again. And again, she was one of the last of her family to become ill. And the other family, excuse my ridiculous computer.
I'll be fine.
The rest of the family got sick and slowly died, and she was one of the last ones. Now, the logic then, they decided, was that she must be surviving by sucking the energy or the life force or whatever for the rest of the family. Obviously, it was consumption going through them. So they decided, she died, and then her one remaining brother got sick, and they decided the only cure for him would be they dug her up to check whether she was a vampire. They took out her heart and lungs, because this was the thing, they decided she hadn't decomposed, so she must be a vampire. And a local doctor tried to point out that she died in the January. It was the coldest time of the year. They hadn't even been able to bury her for a while, because the ground was too hard to dig. So it was no wonder she hadn't decomposed. She'd been in a chiller, you know, for weeks. But they dug her up, they took out her heart and lungs, they burnt those on a pyre, they ground the ashes down and fed them to her brother, who fairly obviously died. And the only reason for this they could come up with was that she must have been a vampire. So before we sort of glamorized it, and perhaps had the luxury of a bit more scientific knowledge to know what is supernatural and what isn't, because obviously science and medicine was improving hugely in the 1800s. But before that, a lot of it, if they didn't understand it, was put down to supernatural activity. So it's easier to blame somebody else. And the one of the big points of the Fluckinger report from Serbia was how all the villagers went out and they all got a bit fanatical about it and went chasing down supposed vampires. But that's human nature again. You know, if everybody is taking on, you need to join in with that to not be the odd one out, because if you're the odd one out, maybe you're the vampire. You know, it's that going along with the crowd, which humans are obviously really prone to doing. So yeah, a lot of it was fear and lack of knowledge of medical processes, scientific, biological medical processes or whatever, that people couldn't understand. And it's human nature to try and put reasoning to it. And if we don't know, we make it up. You know.
I can see that. I mean, that's the source of so many of, I think, our legends and religions we have out there, is a need to explain what can't be explained, you know, because we don't have the scientific knowledge or whatever. So was, if I'm understanding it right, was it sort of the belief that vampirism was almost like a disease that was carried by, and you contracted by being attacked by another one?
It depends on, as with the interpretations these days, the histories are different wherever you look. You know, almost every culture has got an equivalent of it. You've got one culture, which is, I can't remember if it's African or South American, but it's the miracle chicken. You had what was basically a vampiric chicken spirit. It was a demon living in your chicken, and you had to keep it tucked in your armpit. And if you didn't, it would suck your soul. And that was their equivalent. So it's, yeah, look at the miracle chicken, because that's amazing. So you can see how different the versions of them are. So some of them, Eastern European particularly, with the Serbian stuff, they thought if you were attacked by it, in a bit like the way we portray it now, if you were attacked by it, you would perhaps turn into a vampire. But you could avoid that by eating bread that belonged to the vampire. So there's all sorts of weird little superstitions. You could, if you stole and ate their bread and salt, I'm not sure why they'd need bread and salt because they're undead, you know, but the idea being you've somehow got to find the bread and salt that belongs to the vampire, and if you eat it, you will not turn into a vampire. So it's an awful lot of superstition, probably coming from fear, you know, at this point in throughout time before that, you'd had plagues and tuberculosis and cholera and all sorts, and people wouldn't have understood where it was coming from. The only thing they understand is other people. So the instinctive thing is to blame another person for it and make a scapegoat, I guess.
Yeah. That cremating and drinking the ashes just blows my mind. Like at some point in time, somebody with a straight face thought that was a good idea. And then other people agreed with them.
If he wasn't sick before, he would have been by the time he'd done that, wouldn't he?
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
You know, but yeah, that sort of thing, you know, what was common because they had no real medical knowledge. So I suppose in some ways it kind of made sense because they are doing a weird basic version of inoculation, aren't they? They think if you take some of it in, you might react to it and be able to fight it off. So the logic is kind of there, but yeah, no.
Yeah, wild. One of the things I always thought was fascinating, and you see this a lot with vampires, is sort of what I guess I would call the vampire culture. You know, sort of this fandom that sort of surrounds it. And it's been interesting watching it evolve over the course of time, especially, like I said, being of the sort of the Anne Rice generation. I remember when the film version of Queen of the Damned came out, and I went to the movie theater to see it, and it was like a vampire convention. Like everybody who was there, and of course the Anne Rice vampires were the crushed velvet, and the long hair, and sort of I guess you'd call like 19th, 18th century gentlemanly, you know, sort of French aristocrat kind of, you know, and so you saw a lot of that. And then you turn around, and when the Twilight movies are coming out, by then I'm in my 30s. And by then I'm just, you know, at first, I've since, I think, grown up, but at first was sort of like fanboy offended. You know, those aren't vampires. Don't give me that crap. Mr. Sparkles over here. No, that's not how you do it, you know. But you end up appreciating it for what it is, that, you know, it's another interpretation. And I guess it's one of sometimes with that, and I'm off on a side tangent now, you end up more upset with the fandom than the original art of work, you know. That's kind of where I came to with the Twilight thing. Like once I sat down, because the interesting thing is I read the first book, Twilight, before it was huge. You know, a friend of mine, like it had just come out, and a friend of mine, I'd never heard of it, didn't know anything about it, and a friend of mine at work was like, hey, I just read this book, it's about vampires, it's really good. And I'm like, okay, I'm not gonna argue that.
I did exactly the same, read it really early on.
And I read it, I'm like, oh, okay, that's kind of an interesting interpretation. I kind of like some of the angles they took with it. And then it was like overnight, you know, the big, you know, teeny culture exploded all around it, and then you just have to be like, I don't like that stuff, you know. You can't openly admit to anybody that you like Twilight, or you might get beaten in the street.
Well, if anyone's in that position, which I have been as well, there's I've got to give them a shout out. There's an amazing Facebook group called Twilight Sewer Posting, and it actually, the main group is Twilight Shit Posting, but there's an offshoot, Twilight Sewer Posting, and basically you're in the sewer and you can say what you like about Twilight, and it's a running joke that everyone loves it enough to hate it as well. So, you know, they snark and shred, but they love it at the same time, and they're an amazing bunch of people. There's thousands, and some of the posts are appalling. But I think a lot of people are self-aware enough to know it's funny. You know, I mean, I've always said I love Twilight, but I love it despite its faults, not because of them. And mostly I love it because it did bring things out into the open and give it to a new generation of people. My kids watched it all, you know, which perhaps they wouldn't have watched vampire movies otherwise. But yeah, it's an appalling vampire universe. That it's fun, but it's appalling. But yeah.
It's always interesting with those sort of, like, as we move along, the way the interpretations sort of reflect the culture at the time, you know. And I thought about that a lot, and I don't know how much I'm making a stretch here, but that kind of occurred to me. One of the interesting things that Anne Rice frequently talked about is how vampires, especially ones who lived for a long time, would occasionally basically have to go into almost a coma. Like they'd almost have to go into a really long sleep because they mentally had a really hard time just processing the changing of times. And whenever they sort of reawoken, they kind of needed to create another vampire from that time period to help keep them anchored. Um, and I almost feel like that's almost a bigger metaphor for vampires in general, that every generation we have to have a new reiteration of vampires and vampire lore that sort of reflects the culture at that time, and that, and in essence, sort of keeps the legend going, per se, if that makes any kind of sense.
Yeah, no, it does totally, because if we hadn't changed, even if we just had, say, Bela Lugosi's version, and everyone looked like that, it wouldn't fit. It wouldn't fit the modern culture. So yeah, I totally get that. That it has to be adapted. It has to be renewed for something else, even if it's renewed in a very similar way to the original. Because Anne Rice's vampires, as I said, have got that old world glamour. You know, they're a very upmarket Hammer film, really. You know, it's that sort of thing. Whereas in reality, God, if you lived that long, you would stagnate. I mean, there's an interesting one for anyone who's watched the movie version of What We Do in the Shadows. And Peter, who's the oldest vampire, he's like millennia old, whatever, is just almost silent. He's silent and just sits there because he's almost ossified in himself. You know, he's in a coffin, a big stone coffin that he just stands inside it at all times. They chuck a bit of food into him, and he barely speaks. And that's a really good way of doing that, because you would, if you'd have been sitting around for 1,000 years, you'd be bored shitless. And also that fact that you would lose some of your humanity. You'd have had to have watched every single person you love is going to have died, you know, or you may still have your descendants, but they can't know who you are, so you're not getting the joy of your family anymore. And generation after generation have died off, and some will have gone in horrific ways, you know, because that's the statistics. So in reality, if you could live forever, you would have to change. So that fits. But yeah, I think everyone thinks they've invented their generation, don't they? Everyone thinks it's a new thing, and nothing's new. Everything's been around before in one way or another. So I do think you're right in that people want a different version of their vampires. And sometimes it is a bit retro and it goes back, like Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula is almost, it's not quite the original Dracula, but it is almost Dracula. So you've almost gone back 100 years to the original incarnation of Dracula. But so, and then Twilight is a modern one, or Blade is almost a funny movie, but it's a big glossy action movie at the same time, you know. So yeah, they've got to adapt. I was going to say they adapt or die, but they just don't die, do they? But but I suppose that's their downfall, isn't there? They can't die. They've got to keep going. So yes, I think if you were immortal, you would want to switch off for a bit. You know, you'd want to, because even in anybody's normal day-to-day life, we all have days where you think, oh, I wish I could just, nothing awful, you just want to go into standby for 24 hours and just ignore everything and have a break from it all. And if you could never do that, especially if you're the type of vampire that doesn't sleep, because obviously that's another thing that changes depending on your interpretation of your vampire. Some never sleep, some have to sleep, some just get a bit tired. So if you could, but if you're the sort that can never sleep, it's no wonder Edward Cullen was a bit antsy. Yeah. You know, he's a 108-year-old virgin and he can't even sleep. You know, he can't even sleep it off. So you'd be a bit snarky, wouldn't you?
Well, at least he's not dealing with morning wood, so we'll give him that.
But it would be made of marble. How is he not shattered it by now?
We could get into the thermodynamics of friction, but I'm gonna take another exit. Yeah, I suppose if anybody who's met the crusty 90-year-old man going on and on about kids these days, imagine if you were like 390 years old. Yeah. Oh my Lord. Like, can you imagine somebody like Lestat looking at TikTok right now and just being like, oh, I think it's time to switch off for a century. Holy cow.
I don't know. I think Lestat would probably love TikTok. He'd want everyone to look at him, wouldn't he?
You're not wrong.
he would want everyone to look at him. He'd be some cult influencer, wouldn't he?
I'd follow him in a heartbeat.
Oh, sure. Wouldn't everybody? I mean, I think I'd follow Armand maybe, because Louis needs a slap because he's such a crybaby.
Shut up! Right?
He needs, But yeah, yeah, if you were going to live for that long, you'd have to, oh my God, get a hobby or something.
Mhm.
You know, you'd be bored, wouldn't you?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. You would be a total psychopath. Like you,
Yeah, because there's that thing as well, isn't there, about vampires generally, regardless of the interpretation or what their rules are in their particular universe, it's not many of them that have got what we call human morals. You know, Twilight is the ultimate one of moralistic. It's so moralistic. It's a Mormon PSA, basically, that movie. For anyone knows your background, that's because the writer is, and so it fits that worldview. But the vast majority who've been around for a very long time don't have lost or starting to lose the morals. So you've got Lestat, you've got Miriam in The Hunger, you know, just is pragmatic. She's a bit sad when her partners eventually die off, but she cracks on. And that's perhaps as well the appeal of vampires, because we live in a reasonably moral world. We might not agree with the morals, but there are, and some of them are definitely stretched at certain times, obviously, you know, with war and all the rest of it. But human beings generally within individual cultures, we have got a set of social strictures that we live within. And that's how we keep it going. That's how we keep functioning next to each other. Whereas a vampire doesn't live with any of that. And maybe that is part of its appeal, in that they just do what they want. They take what they want, and we can't do that. So however much we'd like to, we can't do that. And we generally wouldn't, because we know the consequences. Most people, it's a running joke that I always think that most people are decent people. They are. So we don't do certain things because it would upset other people. Whereas a vampire is going to eventually, after the 2nd or 3rd century, you're going to stop giving a shit, aren't you? Because humans are just going to become pets that die, and you might neglect them a bit or whatever. You're going to slowly, your morals are going to erode, I think, with time. So maybe that's part of the appeal of them as well. Is they show us, we can imagine for a brief amount of time, we can imagine being able to do what we want. Nothing can hurt us. We can just do what we please. And I think that's as terrifying as it would be liberating, really.
Well, it's definitely an appeal to power, you know, when you think about it, like to be able to be that powerful, that because so much of what we do, I think even subconsciously, we do out of fear, you know. Part of the reason we're like, man, I would just, that guy, boy, if I could just go over there and sock him in the face. But you don't want to get arrested. You don't want to deal with the legal trouble. You don't want to deal with the social fallout. But if none of it matters to you, and human beings just literally become motes of dust that move slowly past you as you move along. Yeah, I think even if you were Mother Teresa when you became a vampire, by about, like you said, by about the, 2nd century or so, you'd just be like, I just don't even care. I'm just going to do whatever I want to do. And because that feeling of superiority would eventually override everything. People in of themselves like to think they're superior to other people or other, other races or cultures or something like that. But when you had a biological reason to genuinely believe that, and everybody else is passing you by, and every single person you meet is weaker, more fragile, you'd lose that eventually.
How could you not decide that you were the top of the pile and you could just do what you pleased? And also, by the time you've been around for millennia, you're invariably rich, because you've been around long enough you don't need to eat or drink or whatever. You don't have much consumable cost in your life. You can steal the money and nobody can catch you, or you can earn it and you don't die off. So they're always invariably rich anyway, which is another appeal of it. You've got limitless strength. You're never going to get old. Of course, you're going to think you're better than everybody else. Why would it matter if somebody pushed in your way in a supermarket? You just shove them, because what are they going to do to you? What are they going to do if somebody locked you up? You can break out. So yeah, it's I think most vampires would end up being very egotistical. They'd be sociopathic, wouldn't they?
Well, that's what I always thought was interesting. And again, I know I keep going back to the Anne Rice thing, but that's just my generation. The difference between Lestat and Louis in those books, and the difference in the way they viewed the world. And here was Louis, who was trying for a long time to sort of hold on to that humanity and everything, and even then that began to slip. By the time he got to the modern, like or the time the books were written, you could tell he was kind of starting to, whereas Lestat kind of had a violent introduction to it to begin with, and kind of had a violent life prior to becoming a vampire. Viewed, to him, humans were rats, so you lived off them and did what you had to do.
Yeah, Louis tries to hang on to his humanity. He doesn't want to be it, does he? And he tries and tries and tries to hang on to it, and then realizes, I think, he's got to sink or swim, and he's got to go with it, or it's going to kill him anyway, sort of thing. And yeah, he sees his own humanity slipping as he goes along, to the point where he cares less and less and less about his humanity slipping. It matters less to him. Whereas you're right, Lestat, he just doesn't give a shit about anybody. He doesn't. All he cares about is Lestat, and that's it. And that last moment in the movie version, when it's him in the car and you realize it's just amazing. So yeah, it's weird. I think even the ones that you see are trying to hold on to their morals, although sometimes it does come around the other way. When you look at the Francis Ford Coppola version with Gary Oldman, the movie version, we realize in the end he is being powered by trauma. He wants his lost love back. He's a very sorry and sad character. Doesn't stop him being evil. He just wants to get. So you end up with a bit of a dichotomy. You kind of feel sorry for him, but he's still an awful person. So yeah, and I think that's probably what makes them so fascinating, because there are infinite different versions of them, that there is one to suit everybody. As we've said, even down to kids, you can put a small child in front of versions of vampires.
Yeah.
And it's that human fascination, I suppose, with the idea of not having to die, because the thing that scares most people more than anything is dying. So I think that is the pull. It's the massive velvet gowns are obviously a brilliant bonus, and I'd quite like to wake up every morning dressed in my swishing velvet gown. But I think the major pull of it is the idea of immortality, because death or dying of either themselves or people around them frightens people more than anything else. So if you could avoid that, obviously what everyone forgets is the fact that does mean you would be alive forever.
Right.
What happens when you get to the end of humanity and everyone dies off, and then whoever's left knows who the vampires are, because you're all the only ones left. And then you'll die out because there's no humans.
Right.
It's quite a miserable existence, isn't it? Being there until the actual end times. So to actually live with the knowledge that you are stuck with it until the end is quite terrifying in itself.
That's I always find that to be such an interesting sort of mental exercise. Like, if you were offered immortality right now, would you take it? No. And I have to say, I thought it's interesting. When I was in my 20s, I'd be like, oh hell yeah, let's do this. And now I'm like, oh my God, no. That just sounds like a nightmare. That just sounds like it would be a slow mental death is what it would be, because you just wouldn't be able to handle it eventually.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And interestingly, it's the same, absolutely same in my 20s. Yeah, I'd have ripped your arm off for that sort of offer. I'm in my 50s now, and you'd think I'd be keener on it, but actually, no, absolutely not. I am happy with I'd like to live to a ripe old age, but I'm happy with there being a finite span of life and death. Also, what people always assume is that you will live, you would be immortal in some youthful, amazingly glamorous body. Well, anyone who's seen The Hunger knows that that's what David Bowie thinks he's got, and he doesn't. He suddenly ages. So he has been made immortal, but what he hasn't been given is eternal youth. So when he tries to when he stops feeding for a bit, and he suddenly starts aging, and he's going to be, it's not how it turns out, but he is going to be locked into a box just as a crumbling corpse for the rest of eternity. So there is that thing, and I asked an awful lot of people for this book whether they would take immortality. The vast majority of people said no, whatever the age, said no. One or two went with it and said, yeah, absolutely, I could travel everywhere, I could do whatever I want. You know, you've got endless lifetimes, you could do everything. The vast majority of people said no, because they just can't comprehend that amount of time, and it only works if you are given him, you know, eternal youth as well as eternal life. So which then shows how self-obsessed, I suppose, humanity is as a whole, because we can't imagine being a little bit decrepit. You know, we want to live it with a perfect working body or whatever. So yeah, no. If you'd have asked me in my 20s, yeah, I'd absolutely snapped your hand off and bought a lot of black velvet. But in my 50s, no. There's going to come a point where I'm tired. You know, I'm going to be done at some point. Thanks. I'm tired now. Never mind what I'm going to be like in my 80s.
Right. Well, I think about that. I'm like, God, you know, if I was made into a vampire in my 20s, it'd be one thing. If you did it to me now, I'd be so angry. I'm like, you tell me I got to deal with bad knees for the next couple hundred years? Give me a break.
I get up in the morning. I'm not upright until I get to the door. You know, I have to unfold myself. I don't want to do that every morning for eternity. Thanks.
No, thank you. Do we know, because you had said that like Bram Stoker's Dracula was kind of like set the template that we all look at. What do we have any idea what his motivation or muse or creative idea was behind coming up with that?
No, there's lots and lots of theories about it, but not really. His background at that point was interesting. He was a big friend of Oscar Wilde, who was prosecuted for homosexuality and went to prison, and eventually he died after he came out of prison, but it was sort of injuries and mental health issues from his prison sentence that really killed him. So he knew what it was like to be an outsider. There is a massive long-running theory that Bram Stoker was gay. I'm not convinced he was gay. I think he was almost certainly bisexual. He wrote some very florid letters to Walt Whitman, the poet, in a very sort of almost sort of look at me and trying to attract him kind of way. They're amazing letters. But he was happily married and whatever to Florence Balcom, who incidentally was Oscar Wilde's first love. So it was all terribly tangled. And she chose Bram Stoker over Oscar Wilde, and Oscar was heartbroken despite actually really being a gay man. So no, he was living in the late 1800s. You know, there was an awful lot of death and destruction going on around him. There's an argument that maybe some of it was influenced by the Ripper murders, which were sort of 7 or 8 years previous to no, but probably about 10 years previous to Dracula coming out. I don't think it is. I don't think that's relevant. I think it was just he worked in a theatre at the time anyway, so he was theatrical in his ways. He was assistant to Henry Irving, the theatre manager, and didn't earn a massive amount of money. So I'd imagine he did write anyway. So I think a lot of it was probably he just wrote, and it was like a lot of writers, I think, took a lot of little ideas from different things and pulled it in together. But he was certainly aware of the effects of Victorian society, you know, the idea of it being buttoned up and this sort of thing, which anyone who knows anything about the Victorians know they weren't. That's what you saw, but they were anything but buttoned up under the surface. So he knew all about that surface calm and it all rolling underneath sort of thing. I have issues with the way he writes Lucy Westenra, who is one of my favourite characters out of any vampire story, because she is, it's the Madonna whore trope. You've got Mina Harker as the version of Bride to Be, and you've got Lucy Westenra, who even in the book, you know, and the Gary Oldman version accentuates it even further. But even in the book, you know, she has these 3 suitors that all want to marry her. And Lucy says, why should I choose one? Why can't I have all of them? Why can't we all just be happy? and is very forward for the day. And she's what they would soon come to call a new woman, you know, capitalized the new woman. So there are certain social issues, you know, she gets punished for being sexually aware and open and this sort of thing. So he touches on things, you know, he touches on the politics of what it would have been like to be a woman and that sort of thing. And I do sometimes wonder if he perhaps wanted to think about the idea of escape himself, because I think he probably wasn't living quite his true life. There's a theory that he actually died of syphilis. He certainly had the death certificate is written in a way that was written at the time is the, I can't remember the terminology now, there's a particular medical term, motor ataxia it is. And it's a certain brain disease type thing that is usually late stage syphilis. So generally when that's on a death certificate, it's assumed that the person died of syphilis. That said, he was still writing, you know, a couple of weeks before he died. I seem to recall it was quite close. And you'd have had dementia by that point had you got late stage syphilis. There's certainly questions about what his true feelings about different people and places were. I've spoken to his great nephew Dacre. I think I can't remember how many greats Dacre's got these days. And he, you know, the family opinion seems to be just that he just wrote a good book, you know, and there is that angle. We are looking for reasons for it, you know, and that's human nature again. We look for reasons. Why did Polidori write his? Because people don't ask so much about that. But Polidori wrote his because he got an idea from something Byron wrote. He took that and he turned that into The Vampire. It was actually published under Byron's name to start with because the publisher knew it would sell more copies, and there was a big kerfuffle about it, but it got Polidori's name on it. And he really just used, Byron was his boss at the time and then they fell out. He used Byron as a template for that, you know, and that's just a story. They're not everything has to have huge, deep meanings. It doesn't mean it can't have them, but they're the meanings that we're putting on them.
Right.
You know, there's a modern tendency to see vampires as this ancient, like the ancient text and what does it say and this sort of thing. They're just books.
Mm-hmm.
You can have different versions. You can make up any vampire you like and it's okay. It will be right because it's your version of the vampires. There are ideas of what we would now consider a vampire, actually more like what we would consider now is way back in history. So you get your revenants and your whatever, your undead in between. But if you go way back, you've got sort of blood drinking, seductive demons, Gilgamesh, the king Gilgamesh, and we're going back to the Sumerian king list now, which I think is 3400 BC. So a long, long way back. And he's written, I can't remember, never remember which way around it is. I think he's a Lilu and the female version is a Lilitu, one way around or the other. And he's listed as that on the Sumerian king list. And as anyone knows who's read the Sumerian king list, at this point, they're saying people are living for hundreds of years. So maybe they did. Maybe Gilgamesh was, a vampire. Also Lilith, who was Adam's first wife in the Bible, who conveniently gets cut out an awful lot. She was Adam's first wife and she was created equally from the clay and she's equal to him. But she refused to be subordinate to him because they were created equally. So she was cast out of Eden. And very rapidly, the stories turn Lilith into a baby-killing monster who drinks the blood and this sort of thing. So there are old stories. I think it's the Astraea, who is from the Sefer Hasidim, which is the Jewish book of the pious. I'm really dredging my memory of the right titles now, which I think is in the 13th century. She drinks blood through her hair. So there are blood drinking demons, and they were bringing them into sexuality even back then. King James, who's the same King James that wrote the Bible, that rewrote the Bible for the King James version of the Bible that everyone knows today, he also in the 1500s wrote the book of demonology, in which he goes into great detail about, he's clearly given this some thought and he's working out the logistics of incubus and succubus and how a male a demon could steal a human man's semen and get it to a woman in order to use it himself to impregnate a woman and get there quick enough before it went cold. So this is King James, who's putting some real thought into the shelf life of human semen for the use of demons. So it goes round in circles.
And the stuff people came up with back when they didn't have Netflix, you just sit and concoct the weirdest things,
But this is the thing. Even King James, he was thinking about it. The Jewish books are mentioning things about it. The Sumerian king list mentions it. This is going in circles and circles over as far back as we've got records. Mm-hmm. So we have the privilege and the luxury of having more ways of spreading the ideas and the thoughts. We've got bigger and closer networks, mm-hmm. because 20 years ago I wouldn't be able to have this conversation with you because we're on different continents. Right. And now it's a normal thing. My brother lives in Italy and I live in England, but I just ring him because mm-hmm. It means stories get passed on. And also in some ways I think it's a shame because stories amalgamate as well. Whereas if you look back, you've got these distinctive cultural versions. You've got your incubus and succubus. You've got your armpit chicken. You've got your weird bloaty corpses. But now they're all sort of homogenizing. So I think it's great when you get some that really kick it up. Like, come back to Blade. I love Blade. It's ridiculous. And if anyone has not seen it, there is an Adult Swim version of that scene. Mm-hmm. Which is amazing, and everybody needs to watch it. It's of that scene in the club. It's just wonderful. So you've got that, and it's all power to it, and things like What We Do in the Shadows. I dreaded the TV version because I thought that I love the movie so much. And Johnny Brew, who plays Deacon, was kind enough to contribute to this book, and we've ended up being friends. And I put off watching TV because I thought it'd be terrible, but it's so funny, and that is normal life. That is bringing the creeptastic looking vampires. Nadia is such a goof. Mm-hmm. the look on her face, but she's got the rolling eyed look of so many women over the years. Like, what the fuck are they all talking about? and everybody recognizes their faces. Mm-hmm. So it's good when something like that is a bit different and it's not the cliche, because I think otherwise we're at risk of everybody just seeing the same thing. So yeah, that was me rambling off down my rabbit hole there.
Well, and I'm sure you've heard they're rebooting the Blade series right now, and I'm really excited about that. I feel terrible. I can't remember the main actor's name that they signed to play Blade, but he's a phenomenal actor. He's done.
I've only just heard about it in the last couple of days, and I don't know anything about it at the moment. But I know it's being done. That's all I've heard.
So I'm excited about that. Right after that, were you ever were you ever a fan of the Buffy the Vampire Slayer series?
Do you know what? That is the one that everyone's always shocked because I barely watched it. Mm-hmm. I was the wrong age for it. I did have to watch some of it to write this book because otherwise I wouldn't have known what I was talking about. And I loved it. What I saw, I watched some of it from the very, very beginning because that's what appealed to me. And I knew it. It was always on TV. I've got my brother's 4 years younger than me. So, it's crossed over a little bit over the years. But I was probably that little bit too old for it. Mm-hmm. Like I said, I'm in my 50s now. So it was kind of, by the time it was coming out, it was a bit young for me. But that's a similar thing again. I mean, if you're going to have a high school vampire scene, have the vampire killer in the high school. Buffy, right. She would kick Cullen's ass, wouldn't she?
Oh, yeah. Good night, Sparkles. That was because the people of my age, that was always the thing, because I was like right at that ripe age. Like I want to say I was like 17, 18 when that show premiered. And everybody my age had a crush on Sarah Michelle Gellar at that age. And yeah. I mean, I could get into the thing. Like it was really great that you had a show that was centering around a very, very strong female character to begin with. I mean, that was just great in of itself, culturally speaking. But it was funny that, they could do the whole vampires were unthinking demons because they didn't have a soul, but right off the bat, you've got this mysterious, brooding, handsome guy who just happens to pop in and save her at the last minute and then stoically leaves, only to find out, well, he's a vampire too, but he's different because he has a soul, and that's the burden that he carries. And then it triggers the female, oh, I could just fix him mentality. And so it was that one. And then of course it splintered off, and Angel had its own series, I want to say for 4 or 5 seasons or something like that. And it's just kind of, generationally it's legend. But I'm still waiting for Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter to claim its proper place in history that it deserves. We're not there yet. Time will tell on this one.
Yeah.
But I got a gut feeling.
But some of these ones that are looked down upon at the time are amazing. Is it Dracula Untold?
Yeah.
The other one. Now that I loved. I loved that. Everyone said, oh, it's terrible. It's terrible. And it's just a bit of easy watching eye candy. I thought that was really quite clever. It was done because they did it, they just went for it. You can tell it's a little bit over the top or whatever, and it's a bit naff in comparison to other ones, but they do it with conviction. So it's wonderful. Some different interpretations are just amazing. I'm totally going off on a tangent now. I saw an interpretation last week, a theatre version of Dracula, and this is this thing again about how people can change anything. Of course, Dracula's way out of copyright now, so people can do what they like with it. I saw a theatre version by a theatre group called Imitating the Dog, and it's called Dracula: The Untold Story. And the idea is there's only 3 people in the actual play. The centre character is Mina Harker, and the idea is it's set in 1965, and the idea is she has been killing people for the past 70 years since and they say, well, Dracula was killed in 1895, but she was infected by him, so she kept going, and she's been killing people, and it's almost funny in places. She has been killing people. It's a moral thing again. She's been killing people before they could get evil, because this is a parallel universe that it's set in. So she talks about killing Mussolini. She talks about having a go at Hitler, and this sort of stuff. And that is so sort of Mina Harker is made to be the main character of that. And it's such a clever production. I mean, this probably only applies to people in the UK, but if they can see it, watch it, because it's amazing. The stage sets are incredible. But going back to the film ones, yeah, things like, the terrible versions of them, or even the Gary Oldman one, Keanu Reeves. I love Keanu. What the hell is going on with his accent? I mean, I'm British through and through, but I don't know anyone that speaks like that. But it doesn't matter, because it is kitsch and it's ridiculous, because these are blood-sucking creatures of the night. As far as we know, they do not exist. So they don't have to be clever or cool. Vampires are not cool. They're funny and silly and murderous and terrible and wonderful. And there's nothing cool about it. People need to stop worrying about it. They're interesting and they're funny and they're fun. And that's what I think I really would wish people would get. They're fascinating. They are fascinating, because really they are an illustration of our own psyche in a lot of ways. So that's my vampire theory.
I love it. It's gotten better over time, because there used to be a bit more of a social cultural taboo about it. I even remember being like 13, 14 years old, 15 years old, and reading Anne Rice novels, and you kind of semi kept it underneath your pillow, because certain people might not approve of what it is you were reading. And then Twilight comes out, and it's like every 14-year-old's like, I want to be a vamp,
Yeah, suddenly it's socially acceptable.
Right. Yes. Well, okay. Well, we are up against the clock. So I'm going to let you go. I cannot thank you enough for agreeing to come on. This is fascinating. And I'm going to show it again to anybody who's watching on YouTube. Here it is. By all means, it is great. I'm not quite done with it yet, but I've made a good chunk of the way into it, and I will definitely be finishing it. It's a fantastic topic, and it's very well written. It's witty, it's fun, it's informative. I mean, everything you want out of a book like that. So fantastic job for me. But I'm going to let you go. Anything you want to say on the way out?
No, follow, if anyone's watching wants to follow me on Twitter or Instagram, I'm at Violet Fenn on both of those. I've got another book out next year, but that's about the Regency, but it does cover Byron, everybody's favorite fuckboy. Yeah, no, that's it. Come follow me and chat. I like talking to people. So if anyone wants to come and find me on social media and have a chat and ask me anything they want, I am there.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you again so much.
Thank you for having me.
You
I've
betcha.
really enjoyed it.
Yeah, absolutely.